Hello everybody, and welcome to the first ever episode of my series, Journey of an Artist. This is going to follow my journey through art, which is just now kind of beginning. I mean, I have painted a little bit before this, but not much. So while I'm getting my canvas ready, I kind of want to tell you a little bit about what this show is going to be, a little bit about myself and my journey into art this far, why a lantern, as well as the story of fire. But before I go any further, I do feel like it's important to note this is not a tutorial video. I do have a philosophy about why it's a bad idea to exclusively follow tutorials. Now, I want you to take this into consideration. A lot of people, when they are learning how to paint, they will try and copy masters' paintings. And usually those masters' paintings are people like, Da Vinci, Van Gogh, whoever it is, you name it, they're trying to copy it because they're trying to see if they can control the paint in the way that they're trying to control it. There's a ton of value in doing this, but most of those people, like, Da Vinci, Van Gogh, they've been dead for a really long time. So they're not following a step-by-step guide on how to create that painting. They are simply just trying to recreate it the best that they can based solely off what they see and the techniques that they do know. And as you're developing more techniques while you're trying to study these masters, you'll find that you'll grow a lot faster as an artist. So if you are struggling with learning how to paint something, then yeah, it might be a good idea to go watch a tutorial on that specific thing so you can kind of see how others do it. But don't necessarily seek out tutorials on how to paint this specific thing if that's all you're trying to paint. Like in this instance, if you're trying to paint a lantern, it might behoove you to just try and paint a lantern first, and then if you're struggling with something like glass, then go seek out a tutorial on how to make realistic looking glass. Obviously, my approach is to not follow a tutorial at all so that I can develop my own techniques that I can apply to other things. In essence, this is just one big trial and error. Okay, now that I got that out of the way, I feel like I can kind of discuss more about this show. So this show is meant to be somewhat of like a philosophy, podcasty type thing where I paint something and I discuss it. It's a way for me to combine both my passion of talking about philosophy and creating art. I've always been very passionate about both. I've always considered myself to be an artist, even though I never really had an art teacher or anything like that. Well, let me rephrase that. I did have an art teacher, but she was also my school principal and my PE teacher, and it was only in the 7th grade, and she taught watercoloring, which is just like one of the worst mediums to start out with because it's notoriously just very difficult. And so for the longest time, I just kind of thought I hated painting. And yes, I did go to a school that was very rural, and they did not value art at all, so it's really not any fault of this teacher, and I'm sure she did the best that she could. So now you may be wondering, how do you go from thinking that you hate something to now making videos of you doing that exact thing? Well, life's a little funny like that, I guess, but really my journey into the art world started in December of 2022. I took my wife out for a little birthday dinner, and when we returned home, our entire apartment was filled to the brim with smoke. We had a house fire, and I remember running inside, rushing in, grabbing fire extinguishers, taking bowls of snow and putting it on the fire and extinguishing it, before any of the firefighters arrived or anything like that. And I distinctly remember walking in and seeing our vinyl records just melted. Years worth of memories that had been collected with both my wife and I, because that's just kind of something we'd done. We thrifted and gone around and bought each other gifts that were records, and it just made me realize that nothing after this was ever going to be the same. And I didn't realize how right I was going to be about that, because about a month later I lost my job. And so I just ultimately felt like my entire world had just burned down so quickly. Everything that I had known was now no longer the same within such a short amount of time. And as I was kind of trying to cope through and work through some of these things with family members, both of my immediate family and my wife's family, I remember and recall a visit with one of my wife's aunts where she said to me, "It seems like the universe is trying to tell you to find your fire." And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, yeah, maybe, but what is my fire? What is it that I care about? Because I didn't really care about that job. It hurt to lose so much so quickly. And that was kind of just a thought that had stuck with me for a while. And then a couple months later, while my wife was in her clinical phase of nursing school, we had to travel, right? Because, living in a rural area, we had to go upwards of 200 miles for some of her clinicals. And so they were usually night shifts. And what I would do is I would drive her up during the day, and she would go do her clinical at night, and I would go sleep in the parks during the night. And thankfully, I only had one bad interaction with a police officer. It was a little bit scary, but I was kind of living my life as a vagabond. I was still a little bit lost, but I felt okay just kind of being some dust in the wind. And I'd take my guitar and my dog, and we were hanging out in the park, and life was good. It wasn't that I had a lot going, but it was good. And my wife kind of thought my spirits might still be, a little crushed by the year that we'd had. And so she decided she was going to buy us tickets to a museum for an exhibit on Van Gogh. It was an immersive experience with 360-degree projections, and he sat on a little beanbag, and it told you the story of Van Gogh's life. And again, I never had an art teacher, so I didn't really know anything about this guy. I knew that he made that Starry Night painting and that he was famous, but I didn't realize that that guy had lived his whole life never knowing how influential he was in the art world. See, his whole life he had kind of thought that he was a failure, and it kind of was, in a weird way, really inspirational to realize that this guy had so much passion for what he did that even though he never saw success with it, he just kept doing it because he felt like he needed to. For him, it was all a labor of love. And I realized that's what I needed. I needed something just like that was my fire, my passion, something that I felt like I needed to because it was my labor of love. And so essentially that's really why I created this series, because my two passions in life are creating art of any form or any variety and talking about philosophy. So, on the way home from my wife's clinical, I decided to stop and get some cheap paint, some cheap brushes, and some cheap canvas board, and we had ourselves a date night paint night. And I really enjoyed it. So, the next day, I painted again. And the day after that, I painted again. I was really enjoying what I was doing. I felt passion behind something. Okay, now that I've kind of told you the story of how I got into painting, into art, I kind of want to turn my focus to the subject on the canvas. Now, this particular composition is something that I have painted before. This is my second attempt. Hopefully I've improved a little bit. But the first one I gave to my father because he's the one that gifted me the lantern in the first place. And this lantern is one of those things that I did lose in the fire. The glass got really hot and broke. But I was lucky enough that I captured a snapshot of it, so I had something to reference. But beyond my personal connection to painting a lantern, it's largely symbolic and almost kind of ironic to choose it as a subject matter if you truly think about it. I mean, the lantern, which is kind of a relic of the past, has largely been replaced by the light bulb, and the paintbrush replaced by AI, replaced by cameras. So for me, it kind of just felt like a piece of art that I felt like I needed to make. And when you think about light bulbs and AI, these are synthetic creations made by humans that affect our daily life. And you're like, well, I like my light bulbs. I like having a well-lit bathroom. Well, yeah, me too. But I want you to think about the fact that paint, which largely for a long time came from the earth, and fire, which also came from the earth and physics, or wherever that comes from. I'm no scientist, I don't know, but it's a naturally occurring thing that we harnessed to have as part of our life. And when it was in our homes, it was kind of akin to like having a house plant. It was a natural connection, natural bridge to the world that reminded us of our humanness. And so part of me really wonders if it's one of those natural connections that we're missing out on, because truly, a little bit of fire has to be instinctual, not just the warmth, but just the fact that it's been part of our society and our civilization for so long that humans are truly connected to fire. And it kind of makes you wonder, if perhaps the reason that things like depression or anxiety have kind of run rampant in modern day society. I mean, we can talk about, the internet and how it fuels those things through disconnect, but really how much of our world has changed so quickly that we haven't realized the repercussions of abandoning long form traditions and what it really did for us. Because another thing that I kind of want to touch on just briefly is when you think about fire, and when you say you lived a couple thousand years ago and your little tribe had a fire, and people would sit around and kind of tell their stories of the day, like that connection around fire and just how people were able to connect so much easier back then because they had avenues to do so. And so, it's kind of interesting when you're tying it all back to this harnessing of the wild. And at what point does harnessing the wild change humanity and change humans? Because this is probably the start of an era that we are the most disconnected from the humans of the early days than we have ever been. Because even 100 years ago, people were still using wood to cook food. And now, ironically, wood-fired food is like a luxury item. I mean, this world is kind of upside down compared to what it used to be. Which kind of makes you think of AI, which in some form and fashion is this newfound method of cooking when it comes to art. And in all reality, when you look at how cooking progressed after the invention of gas stoves and things of that nature, it kind of went downhill. Meaning people cooked less and less and less, largely because of the introduction of convenience foods. And so it became so much easier to just use a microwave or just buy that soup on the shelf and put it in the pot and warm it up. And so people cooked less. And AI will likely do the same thing to real forms of art. It'll discourage people from painting, from creating art that's real. And so I think you'll actually start to see a resurgence of art holding its value, at least real made art. Art that truly was painted onto the canvas. The real trick is going to be proving that it's real art, because when you can fabricate things like this so quickly, it becomes much more difficult to tell when something is real or not. And speaking of AI art, is it really art? I mean, a computer is an input and output machine. You input data and it outputs data. Is that what we're doing when we're putting paint on a canvas or sculpting clay with our hands? Is that just an output of data? I mean, without humans and without our source material, AI could not create art. It has no desire to, but humans were creating art simply in caves, just because we needed to express an idea, to symbolize our family or the thing that we were hunting that day. Humans have innately been drawn to creating art simply because we feel compelled to. AI would not create art if we didn't tell it what art was. I mean, the best way to really think about what AI does when it's quote unquote creating art is it's like coming up with this really funny joke, and then your friend steals that joke and goes and tells other people and passes it off as their own. Like, yeah, AI can kind of extrapolate some things and combine some different styles. It's essentially a fancy Photoshop, but it's not really adding anything to the conversation because it requires source material that already exists in order to combine it and create something new. Whereas humans can just kind of picture something, either in their mind or see something in real life, and they can create from that. And how is an AI ever supposed to do something like what Van Gogh did without never having Van Gogh existed in the first place? And it's important to remind ourselves exactly what Van Gogh went through. He did it because of passion, not because of success. So do things because you love them, not because they reward you monetarily or with status, right? It's very important that you find something you love and you continue to do that throughout your life. It will make you much happier. Well, that's all that I have for this video. So if you've liked what I've done here, please consider liking and subscribing. It means the world to me. Thank you for tuning in.